you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in a business. Not because they want to do it, just because they heard it pays. And who the fuck wants to be poor knowing that's how we've been raised? Society is getting heavy, I can feel the weight. The pressure of success is like 100 million pounds of shit.
How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, we're going to explore obligation again. It's just a manipulative tactic that inmates use to try to get staff to feel indebted towards them. And I think it's a great dialogue. We're going to go a little bit deeper than we did last time. There's a couple areas that I want to cross into. My guest today is going to be jail admin. We had him on before. His name is Andrew Abney-Brotz. Did I get it?
Close enough.
Yeah, close enough. Hey, Andy, how you doing, brother? Everything good?
I'm great. How are you doing, Anthony?
Good, hanging in there. Do you mind introducing yourself to our audience again?
Yeah, sure. Andrew Abney-Brotz from Wayne County, Indiana. I'm jail administrator for Wayne County Sheriff's Office. It's good to be aboard again.
It's good to have you. I got to remember, Brotz, right? It's Brotz?
Correct. Yep, you got it.
So obviously this is a good topic because we want to make sure our staff is aware of the games that inmates can play that motivate us without realizing we're being pushed into that direction. So again, we want to cross into obligation again because there's some areas that I want to touch on that I haven't done before. And I think it's going to be a great dialogue, especially because we have two administration here, two people from admin talking. So this is going to be interesting, a little high level dialogue, if you will. Now, guys, if you haven't the show, Tier Talk to you brave men and women that work in corrections. So please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. We're going to go to our sponsor, and when we come back, we'll be discussing feelings of obligation. Stand by.
I wanted to attend a university that had an intelligence program. I wanted to look at problems different. I wanted to increase my critical thinking abilities. AMU offered those avenues to expand. Obtaining your degree as an adult, you're actually paying yourself and investing in yourself. You can't put a dollar on it, it's priceless. It's something that can never be taken away from you.
American Military University. Learn from the leader.
Guys, inmate manipulation is a course that is highly needed. It's the process that's so slow moving and subtle that you don't realize it's happening. When inmates choose to manipulate, they manipulate our need to react. Situational awareness and insight is going to save your career. It's going to save you from doing foolish things. Listen to your gut. So the more insight we have, the more we can recognize what isn't so overt, and we can correct our behavior before we fall into a trap that we can't get out of. If you allow an inmate to pull you out of your prescribed role, you are opening up a door for a host of problems. Inmate manipulation, the psychology behind inmate manipulation. Available now. Link in description. Hey, so Andy, what do you think I mean when I mention obligation towards an inmate?
You know, it just hearing the word obligation just sounds like, I'm obligated to do something else for somebody. Not necessarily an inmate, but since we're using it in this context, it's just, ask me to do something and then come back later and say, hey, can you do this for me? That's kind of what I imagine that word to sound like just off the top.
Right. And we want to take concern when an inmate says, I'll do you a favor or I'll only do it for you, Officer Gangi. To me, that means like, okay, wait a second. Am I being put into this person's debt? Is there a reason why this inmate is saying favor? Is there a reason why this inmate is saying, I'm only going to do it for you? Because think about this, guys. We have directives, right? Within that directives comes our level of authority. So if I give a directive that is, professional and ethical, if you will, I expect 100% compliance from the inmate population. This is not a negotiation here. I want you to do this, and then I expect the inmate to react accordingly. Now, if I went ahead and I said, I need you to do this, and the inmate goes, well, only for you, or I'll do it for you as a favor, in your opinion, Andy, who really has the power there?
I'd say the inmate does, because he's wanting something in return.
The funny thing is, guys, I don't think people realize the power of those key words. the power of the word favor and why it's being employed, or the power of the I'm only going to do it for you. There's power behind that. There's like Andy said, there's something there that says, yeah, I'm going to do this for you, but there is an expectation, and it comes across when the person says favor. Think about this. I give out directive. That's 100% a directive. And then the inmate comes and softens that up by saying, well, I'll do you the favor. A lot of us will actually sit there and accept that verbiage. We won't redirect it. We'll accept it and say, well, as long as the job is getting done. And we find ourselves doing that when we're in acts of desperation. I'll give you an example. If I have a supervisor that's on my ass about the cleanliness of my unit, and he makes it known to the inmate population about how bad he thinks I'm doing, which is unprofessional to begin with, but let's say it gets out there, these inmates are going to know that I'm desperate. This is not a want anymore. This is a need. So an inmate's going to come out, and one thing is try to push for that favor, but there's also something else here. They're pushing for a level of reliance on them, because now if my area is a mess and this supervisor comes in again, I'm in trouble. So this inmate's going to know this. He's going to come out, or she's going to come out and say, listen, I'll do what I got to do. I'll go above and beyond for you, not for anybody else. I'll do you this favor now out of desperation, because it's perfect timing from the inmate. They're taking advantage of a situation that just happened between me and my supervisor. So they're going to come out of nowhere. They're going to push this need, because it's a need. I need help right now. They know I'm desperate. And then another thing happens out of this obligation is a feeling of reliance towards this inmate now, because the inmate is helping me take care of a need. Now, I'm sure, Andy, in your situation here, let's say a supervisor did do that to an officer, push them into this act where if you don't get this area cleaned immediately, this is what's going to happen to your ass, pretty much, plain and simple. Do you think an inmate now has an opportunity, like I said, to pounce on that?
Absolutely. And as well as I do, Anthony, that inmates hear everything. If it's not by your word of mouth, it's by somebody else's word of mouth. And I think it's really important to tell the people, especially administrators and supervisors, that if you're going to get on somebody about a particular part of their job, do it in private, or look around and say, hey, are there any inmates around first? Because I don't want to put my officer in a situation where an inmate will come back later and say, man, your supervisor was, being an ass about it. And it's happened before. It's happened to me before. Like, man, the captain really got on to you about that. So yes, definitely. I think that's a huge key.
Yeah, it's about that perception of authority. As a supervisor, you have to do what you can to make sure that even if there's a way you have to address that officer or that staff member has to remain with that level of credibility that's needed to be that authoritative figure in that unit. So you're right. I definitely 100% agree with, I got to correct something. I'm going to do it in private, but I'm also going to give the officer or the staff member the ability to correct it as well, which means that I'm not going to go correct it to the population. I'm going to go ahead and let that officer handle it so they maintain that level of authority. Now, one of the things here, guys, just want to make sure we're realizing this, is that when it comes to obligation, there's a feeling that we have to pay back. And if you notice in this situation, where I think I spelled it out clearly enough, is you could see why the officer, if they do take the help on those terms from the inmate, if they allow the inmate to employ the word favor, if they allow the inmate to say only for you, you could see where now there'll be a chance where the officer or the staff member is seen in debt to that inmate. I would even go so far as relying on that inmate. I mean, do you see where that crosses the line from now? I got to pay this inmate back, but also to be reliant on that inmate, Andy?
Yep, absolutely. I see it.
So also, I want to mention something else too, guys. Sometimes facilities are run by the labor of inmates, and sometimes the facility itself becomes reliant or in debt to the inmate. We mentioned this before about having that star maintenance worker, the inmate that's just good at what they do. And maybe they're that good for a purpose. Maybe they want to be that good because they don't want to be replaceable. And what happens here is that the facility puts the frontline staff in a bit of in debt. And what I mean by that is, if I have a concern, let's say I have a flood, and at the time I don't have a maintenance crew available, I'm having trouble getting a vendor in, but I have this inmate who's a good plumber, you know, but let's say right now this inmate's in lock because they did something foolish. There could be a good chance that the agency or that facility in desperation now will go ahead and get that supervisor or get that officer to get that inmate out of lock, you know, out of desperation now to go ahead and fix that concern. Do you think that becomes a problem?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It shows favoritism for sure. It gives that inmate a sense of power of the other inmates. Hey, they need me to come out. Look at me, I'm better than they are. Really puts everybody in a bad situation. And it's a perfect example that you are talking about, you know, inmate workers. You know, I have inmate workers in my jail that wax the floors. You know, they might have experience on the outside doing floors or whatever, kitchen work, whatever, it doesn't matter. And then they come to you later on, or I say, hey, thanks for doing that job, it looks good. And then the next day they're like, hey, the game's on late tonight past 11. Can you tell your officers to leave the TV on? It's as simple as that. You know, so it's really easy to fall into that, because if you say, yeah, sure, I'll email my guys and get them, you know, to let you watch the game longer, then it starts. So you really have to just pay attention to what they're saying and what they're asking.
Yeah, those porters or those trustees, I hate the word trustee, they kind of put themselves in a position where maybe they want to go that extra mile, but you as a frontline staff member has to make sure that you regulate how far you need them. And again, be careful with the praise. You know, sometimes you could praise them and put them on such a high pedestal that they realize that you really are relying on them. And as an agency, if you have an inmate that really is a good worker and the officers at the front line see that every time this inmate gets in trouble, you know, you constantly bail this person out, they're going to become disenfranchised because their level of authority lessens now, because they know for a fact that that needed inmate, whatever it is that they're good at, now supersedes their authority, you know. And it's a game played by the population or a manipulative inmate, because again, I'll become this good at this job because I know for a fact that in return, you're going to need me. This isn't a want no more. This is a need. And that obviously will disenfranchise staff from stepping up and writing them, because what's going to happen here is the staff's going to be like, well, what's the sense of writing them? Something's going to happen in this facility and they're going to allow the inmate out anyway. So I think it's really that level of reliance on that inmate that gives that inmate the power to maneuver. But there's also another area of concern too. Sometimes when inmates feel that you have a staff member that's a little tentative in their ways, maybe even overwhelmed by fear, they may offer signs of protection to that staff member. So what happens here is you have a inmate that, let's say, you know, is a leader of a gang or something, has a bunch of inmates under him. Somehow he's earned some authority on that pod. What's going to happen here is if you have an officer that seems to be, or a staff member that seems to be a little nervous, and you can tell by the body language, how they give their directives, what's going to happen is they may offer staff a level of protection. That level of protection is really hoping that staff says yes, because then you become reliant on that inmate. And the funny thing is, it also tests communication too, because at the end of the day, is if an inmate came and offered me protection, I'm going to be like, well, why do I need you? I have my peers. If I have a code, I got 20, 30 people running deep. You know, I got this. I don't need you. So that offer is not just also about being in debt to that inmate, but it's also to see where your communication is. You know, at the end of the day, if someone's offering me protection, it's not going to be an inmate. It's going to be my peers. But what's your thoughts on that type of reliance?
Yeah, definitely good points. You know, it's similar to when you have, and it's a little different on the county level than it is the state level, because we have a rolling door of inmates that come in all the time. They get released in a couple of days, they're back 2 days later. If you have a known issued inmate that's always causing issues or disturbances in your facility, and you put them in a particular housing unit, you know, the inmates know each other, definitely for sure on a local level. And you'll have another inmate come up to the officer and say, hey, I'll take care of this guy for you. You know, that's where it starts. It's so easy for things like that to start. And, you know, it's crazy. You're right.
It opens up that sense of reliance. And
Yeah.
Also, I want to mention too, is even administration. If I had an officer whose life, or a frontline staff member whose life was saved by an inmate, there's an automatic level of obligation or in debt, maybe even reliance eventually, subsequently. that we have to alleviate. Sometimes, you know, even though we may protect ourselves from situations that make us obligated to the inmate population, sometimes stuff happens. I mean, we don't even know if this was a setup, if the inmate, you know, manufactured this to, you know, get into that position. But either way, what administration has to do is find some way for that debt to be paid off and then ultimately transfer that inmate out, even if it's to another county. Because having said that, if an inmate saved my life, you know, and again, I'm desperate, I'm getting assaulted like crazy, an inmate comes up and saves my life, it may be very hard for me to treat that inmate fairly. So, I mean, there could be efforts for maybe me to pay it back. Sometimes facilities will allow that because they know how important that feeling of obligation is. They may allow a little something into the inmate's commissary fund. But for the most part, interactions with that officer and inmate definitely have to be limited, because one thing is that this officer may not be able to do their job effectively because now this person saved my life. I can't write them up. You know, they risked their lives to save mine. And the other thing also is, the reason why you also may want to transfer the inmate out is also for the inmate's own safety. Sometimes it's not looked good upon the other inmates that see this inmate save that officer's life. So it's good just to give them a whole change of environment. But what would you do on a higher level if an inmate did save an officer's life? How would you try to alleviate that level of obligation?
You know, moving them out to different facilities is good. That just ends it right there. You know, getting them out of the environment, making sure the officer doesn't go on that particular range that the inmate's on, you know, at least for a while, if moving them to a different facility is out of the question. But yeah, you're totally right. You know, you got an inmate that saves an officer, and the officer then tries to enforce a rule violation on that inmate later on. You know, the officer then faces retaliation from that inmate, like, hey, I saved your life. What the hell are you doing? You know, so it's, yeah, definitely a good point. But I would definitely try to remove them from that environment, whether it's moving into a different facility. That's the best option, or just, you know, keeping them away from that area.
And I like what you're saying. Every time an officer or a frontline staff member goes to utilize their level of authority, especially against an inmate who has tried to manufacture this obligation, they're going to go ahead and redirect that authority by saying, hey, remember I did this for you? And that's where that level in debt comes in. And guys, if you want to recognize this feeling, because it's a feeling, it's basically knowing that the person doing this favor for you is profiting off it, or will have the potential to profit off it. So I would say anytime an inmate uses the word favor, I'm only going to do it for you, whatever it is, however they employ it, you have to realize that there could be an effort from any inmate to profit off that. So that should be enough to allow you to know that, okay, you know what, this doesn't feel good. I'm not going to allow the word favor. I'm not going to allow the inmate to say I'm only doing it for you. I'm going to redirect my authority and make the inmate know this isn't a negotiation. This is, I told you to do something, and I don't care how good you are at your job, you can be replaced. A lot of the times what happens here is frontline staff, because management may be in a feeling of obligation to that inmate, when the frontline staff goes to address them, even on something small, that inmate's going to be quick to drop the higher level, you know, to kind of steal that level of authority by saying, well, you can go ahead and write me, but I'll go ahead and talk to Mr. Gangi because Mr. Gangi knows the work I do behind this wall. So what that inmate's doing now is he's stealing my level of authority as administration, because I have found myself in a position of being indebted or being reliant on that inmate. So especially at the higher level, it could easily travel down. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I've encountered that myself. You know, an officer enforces a rule or takes privileges away from an entire housing unit, then they do start calling the upper brass, you know, whether it be a corporal, sergeant, lieutenant, or myself. You know, you find out what the problem is and say, hey, what's going on? So they tell you, I don't think this guy was fair. I do think if upper administration's quick to say, okay, not a problem, you know, I like you guys, so I'm going to give your TV back to you, it lets that officer know, you know, well, why am I here? Why am I working here if my rules aren't going to be enforced with the inmate population? So definitely, you know, just kind of shove that back down and say, A, have you redirected this with the officer? Have you written a grievance? Have you taken the proper channels to address the situation? You know, I'm going to back my staff and I'm not going to, you know, give in to you. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and that's great because, again, it's all about that perception of authority. And by the way, we do cover this in the book that we have coming out in the market. We do explore obligation very deeply. But there's other things I want to mention too real quick. that I want to add, and it's when it comes to concession and responsibility. When sometimes there are little rules. I could actually get rid of the notebook here. Sometimes there's little rules as a housing unit we may let slide. Little nuisance things, and then, I understand it's a living. So sometimes we do what we can to navigate ourselves a little bit while, we're interacting with the population. We kind of pick and choose. But I want people to know something, that at any time those little things are challenged by the inmate and it looks like that you're giving over that level of control, that's where the problem is. So I'm going to give you a little example of, let's say an inmate, again, something small. Let's say an inmate has 10 pictures hung up all about their cell. And policy says they're only allowed to have 2. So let's say you as the officer realizes that, wow, I guess I kind of let these inmates live a little bit. Now they're kind of taking advantage of it. Because remember, guys, same thing with the speed limit. If it's 65, you expect people to go 70. If it's 70, you expect people to go 75. So in this case here, if I set the standard, let's say 5, you may get 7, 8, or 9 pictures, but if I keep the standard at 2, then it may go a little above and beyond. But at the end of the day, the standard is 2. Let's say I'm doing my tour and I say, hey, listen, I noticed that you have 10 pictures up. You got to start taking some of them down. Now, of course, the inmate is going to give you a little kickback and explain why he needs all 10 or she needs all 10. But you hold your ground and you say, listen, you got to start taking some of them down. Policy says only 2. So now the inmate decides, you know what, maybe I can manipulate this a little bit. Can I get 5? Can I at least hang up 5? Now, this is, in their mind, this is all manipulation, guys, but it's like an act of concession. I'm going to go ahead and ask for 5, and you're actually, as the officer, going to think, okay, they're meeting me in the middle, but I still set the standard. So therefore you kind of feel responsible for that choice, which is great. You think that you have the authority over that, but you don't. Their act of concession is a ploy to still get what they want and still to steal that power of authority from you. So now, not only do they make that concession from 10 to 5, which you think is an act of good faith, which, well, maybe if I don't respond in kind, because again, we're human, that it just doesn't look favorable. No, the point is you said 2. That's what it is. So now you go from 5 and you reestablish, sorry, I said 2. There is no concession here. At this point, you took advantage of it. I may have let 3 or 4, but now you're hanging up 10. So we're not going to, concede at 5. You have to reestablish the fact that, nope, I said 2. That's it. What's your thoughts on that little bargaining that inmates will try to utilize?
Yeah, I think that's very important to tell your new hires or your new staff members, watch out for this. Stick to your guns. Say no immediately. It's 2. That's what it is. That's what I say it is. I think yes, that's what the policy is. However, I think that in order to establish your authority as an officer, stay away from saying, well, that's what policy is. No, you say that's what I say it is. Do it, or I will take some privileges, or I'll write you up for not complying with my order. And I think that's huge. That's very important to establish that right off the bat, because if you allow 5 or you allow 10, 6 months down the road with that same inmate, what else are you going to allow? Hey, can you bring me something in? And then they're going to start testing you more. I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen in my own facility. And, yeah.
Well, I like what you said. You're talking about the internal versus the external justification. So, you're right. If I want 2. Now, if the inmate goes to argue, I can lean on the policy, but at the end of the day is I want 2. That's what I want. I love what you said that. The weaker side is I want 2 because the sergeant wants 2, or I want 2 solely because the policy says 2. I can lean on that, but at the end of the day, you're going to know for a fact that I want it. I brought it up. I gave the directive, and there is no negotiation. Just a quick little dialogue on obligation. Anything you want to say in closing?
Yeah, just real quick, from an administrator point of view, and just having this back and forth with you, Anthony, kind of struck this up in my head. If an inmate just immediately goes to asking the favor to the top administrator, yourself or myself, and they get by with it, then they're thinking, I've got it. you know, I manipulated the captain or I manipulated the warden of the prison, I've got it. I can do whatever I want now. I can manipulate whomever. So yeah, it's definitely, you know, watching the training videos I've been watching, you know, it's definitely quick to establish that with your new staff immediately, because, you know, someone new coming into corrections might not get that right off the bat, and then it's going to be too late down the road. So it's perfect.
Yeah, I love that. The higher level is the bigger span of control. So why am I going to manipulate an officer if I get to a sergeant? Why would I manipulate a sergeant if I can get to a lieutenant on up? So I mean, because that eliminates the people that would make it an obstacle. And sometimes we don't realize that at a higher level, once you start, you know, falling for these tactics, you're going to start disenfranchising staff because they're going to feel the outcome of that. You know, they are 100%. So now they're not going to want to do their job. And you have a whole facility right now that the inmates have total control of because you started it by allowing something that shouldn't have been allowed. That was well said.
Yeah.
I appreciate that, Andy.
Yeah.
As always, guys, the show is tiered. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe.